The gavel came down with a thunderous crack that echoed through the marble halls of justice, and I watched Margaret Hendrick's face drain of all color as Judge Morrison read the verdict aloud. The plaintiff's case is dismissed with prejudice, and the defendant is awarded full attorney's fees plus punitive damages in the amount of $847,000. What Margaret didn't know, what none of the Willowbrook HOA board knew, was that they'd just tried to sue me in a courthouse I literally owned. The very chambers where they thought they'd destroy me belonged to me, and the rental income from that building had been paying for my legal defense the entire time. But let me back up 6 months, because this story starts with something as innocent as wanting to fix a sagging fence around my ranch property. I'd moved to Willowbrook Estates thinking I'd found paradise. 15 acres of rolling hills, a restored 1,920s farmhouse, and enough space for my horses to roam freely. The property had been grandfathered into the HOA when they built the development around it in the 1980s, which meant I got all the benefits of living in a well-maintained community without most of the restrictions. Or so I thought. The trouble started on a crisp October morning when I noticed my north fence line was starting to lean after a particularly nasty storm. Nothing dramatic, just weathered cedar posts that needed replacing and maybe some fresh wire. I'd done the same repair 5 times over the past decade without issue. I was out there at dawn, coffee steaming in the cool air, measuring post spacing when I heard the click-clack of designer heels on gravel behind me. "Excuse me, but what exactly do you think you're doing?" Margaret Hendricks stood there in her perfectly pressed blazer and pearl necklace, clipboard clutched to her chest like armor. At 62, she'd been HOA president for 8 years running, and she ruled Willowbrook with the iron fist of someone who'd never been told no in her entire privileged life. "Morning, Margaret." "Just replacing some fence posts that got damaged in last week's storm." Her eyes narrowed as she scribbled something on her clipboard. "I don't see any permit application for fence modification in our files." "Permit?" I almost laughed. "Margaret, this is maintenance on existing fencing. Same height, same materials, same location. I've done this repair before." That was under the previous boards. Looser interpretation of the rules. She smiled that tight-lipped smile that meant trouble. "We've recently updated our architectural guidelines. Any fence work now requires board approval, a structural engineering report, and neighbor impact assessments." The coffee suddenly tasted bitter in my mouth. "You're kidding." "Do I look like I'm kidding?" "The application fee is $2,500, plus whatever the engineering report costs. We'll need detailed blueprints, soil composition studies, and written consent from all adjacent property owners." I stood there holding my measuring tape, watching this woman try to turn a $200 fence repair into a months-long bureaucratic nightmare that would cost more than my truck. "Margaret, with respect, that's insane. We're talking about replacing 4 fence posts." Her smile got colder. "Rules are rules, David. I'd hate to see you face compliance action over something so preventable." That's when I knew this wasn't really about fence posts at all. See, Margaret had been circling my property like a vulture ever since her son Bradley graduated college with a real estate license. She'd made 3 generous offers to help me sell to developers who wanted to subdivide my land into mini mansions. Each time I'd politely declined, and each time her smile had gotten a little sharper, but I underestimated just how far she'd go. 2 days later, I found the violation notice zip-tied to my mailbox like some kind of scarlet letter. UNAU THORIZ EDCONS TR UCTIONACTIVIT YCEASEANDDESIST IMM DEIAAEATELY. The fine was $500 per day, until I removed the illegal modifications and submitted proper applications. The illegal modifications? I'd replaced exactly 2 fence posts. I called the HOA office, thinking surely this was some kind of mistake. Maybe we could work it out like reasonable adults. Willowbrook Community Management, this is Cindy. Hi Cindy, this is David Morrison. I got a violation notice that seems… Oh, Mr. Morrison. Her voice went from professional to apologetic instantly. I'm so sorry, but Mrs. Hendricks left very specific instructions that all communication regarding your situation has to go through the legal department now. My stomach dropped. Legal department? She said you were being aggressively non-compliant and that the board voted unanimously to pursue formal enforcement action. I hung up feeling like I'd been sucker punched. Aggressively non-compliant? I'd fixed 2 fence posts on my own property using the exact same materials that had been there for 30 years. But Margaret was just getting started. The next morning brought a certified letter from Kellerman, Marsh & Associates, the most expensive HOA litigation firm in the state. 3 pages of legal jargon that boiled down to, pay us $15,000 in fines immediately, tear down your fence repairs, or we'll sue you into oblivion. I read it twice, then called my neighbor Jim Kowalski. Jim had been in Willowbrook since the beginning, and his property shared my longest fence line. Jim, did the HOA contact you about giving consent for my fence repairs? There was a pause. What fence repairs? Margaret said, I needed written consent from adjacent property owners for the permit application. David, nobody asked me for any consent. Hell, I didn't even know you needed permits for maintenance. I fixed my fence 3 times over the years. That's when the pieces started clicking together. Margaret hadn't just ignored her own application process. She'd deliberately set up a bureaucratic maze, then triggered enforcement action before I could possibly navigate it. She wanted me gone, and she was willing to weaponize the entire HOA legal system to make it happen. But Margaret Hendricks had made one critical error in her research. She'd assumed I was just another suburban homeowner who'd roll over when faced with legal threats. What she didn't know was that 20 years ago, I'd started buying commercial real estate as investment properties. Small buildings, mostly a strip mall here, an office complex there. Nothing flashy, just steady rental income that let me live comfortably on my ranch. One of those properties happened to be the Willowbrook County Courthouse Annex building, where all local civil disputes got heard. I'd owned Judge Morrison's chambers for 15 years. Not that I was ready to play that card yet. First, I wanted to see just how dirty Margaret was willing to fight. The answer came faster than I expected. I was out feeding my horses when I saw the surveyor's truck pull up to my gate. 2 guys in orange vests started setting up equipment right on my property line, and when I walked over to ask what they were doing, the older one handed me another certified letter. Emergency Boundary Verification Survey, authorized by Willowbrook HOA under Section 847B of the Community Covenants. I'd never heard of Section 847B, probably because Margaret had written it into the covenant sometime in the last month. But according to this letter, the HOA now had the right to survey any property where boundary disputes or encroachment issues may exist. What boundary dispute? I asked. The surveyor shrugged. Ma'am says your fence might be on HOA common property. We're just here to measure. My blood started to boil. Margaret wasn't just trying to stop my fence repair. She was questioning whether I even owned the land it sat on. For 3 days, those surveyors tramped all over my property with their equipment, leaving flags and stakes everywhere. My horses were spooked, my morning routine was shot, and every time I looked outside, I saw orange vests, reminding me that Margaret Hendricks was trying to steal my peace of mind. When the report came back, I wasn't surprised by what it said. significant questions exist regarding the placement of existing fencing relative to recorded property boundaries and HOA common areas. It was complete garbage. My property had been surveyed twice in the past decade, and both times confirmed that my fences were well within my boundary lines. But Margaret wasn't interested in facts. She was building a legal case. The final straw came on a Friday afternoon in November. I was in town getting supplies when I got a call from Jim Kowalski. His voice was tight with anger. "David, you need to get home right now. They're tearing down your fence." I broke every speed limit getting back to my ranch, but I was too late. A crew from Hendricks Construction, Margaret's son Bradley's company, was loading the last of my fence posts into their truck. 24 hours of work, hundreds of dollars in materials, all being hauled away like garbage. Margaret stood supervising with that same cold smile, clipboard in hand. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I demanded. "Enforcement action, as outlined in our previous communications." The fence was constructed without permits on disputed property boundaries. She held up an official-looking document. "Emergency removal order, signed by the Architectural Review Committee this morning. This is destruction of private property. This is community compliance, Mr. Morrison. Perhaps if you'd followed proper procedures from the beginning, we wouldn't be in this position." I looked at my torn-up fence line, at the smug expression on Margaret's face, at her son Bradley directing his crew like he owned the place. Something inside me snapped. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, Margaret." Her smile faltered slightly. "Is that a threat?" "No," I said quietly. "That's a promise." That night, I sat in my study with a glass of bourbon and started making phone calls. The first was to Elizabeth Chen, the best litigation attorney in the state. The second was to my property management company. "Beth, it's David Morrison. Remember when you said if I ever needed a good lawyer for something serious, to call you?" "Of course. What's going on?" I told her everything: the fence repairs, the permit trap, the fraudulent survey, the destruction of my property. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "David, this sounds like targeted harassment designed to force you to sell. That's illegal on about 6 different levels. Can we prove it? With the right discovery process?" "Absolutely. But litigation against an HOA can be expensive and time-consuming. They'll try to drag it out, run up your legal bills, make you give up." I smiled grimly. "Money and time aren't going to be problems." "Okay, but you need to understand they'll probably escalate. File liens against your property, try to foreclose, maybe even seek criminal charges for permit violations. These people play dirty." "Good," I said. "So do I." The next week brought Margaret's nuclear option, a lawsuit seeking $250,000 in damages, claiming my fence repairs had irreparably damaged community property values and violated numerous covenant restrictions. She'd filed it in Willowbrook County Court, case number CV 2024-8847, assigned to Judge Morrison's courtroom in the building I'd owned since 2009. The irony was so perfect I almost laughed. But I kept that information to myself while Elizabeth started building our defense. Discovery requests, depositions, document subpoenas, the full legal warfare treatment. And with every filing, Margaret's true motivations became clearer. The smoking gun came during her deposition in December. "Mrs. Hendricks," Elizabeth asked, "can you explain why the HOA's architectural committee didn't meet to discuss Mr. Morrison's fence until after enforcement action had already begun?" Margaret shifted uncomfortably. The violation was so obvious that immediate action was warranted. But according to HOA meeting minutes, the committee discussed Morrison property acquisition opportunities 3 times in the 6 months before this fence issue arose. "Can you explain what those discussions involved?" That's taken out of context. Elizabeth slid a document across the table. These are email exchanges between you and your son's construction company, dated 2 weeks before Mr. Morrison's fence was damaged in the storm. The subject line is Willowbrook Ranch Development Timeline. Would you like to read what it says about forcing current owner cooperation? Margaret's face went white. I invoke attorney-client privilege. Mrs. Hendricks, your son isn't your attorney. That's when I knew we had her. But Margaret still had one more card to play, and it was a doozy. 2 weeks before our court date, I found sheriff's deputies at my door with a foreclosure notice. According to the documents, my failure to pay HOA fines had triggered a lion against my property, and the HOA was now seeking to force a sale to recover community damages. $127,000 in alleged fines, penalties, and legal fees, all stemming from my 2 fence posts. This is insane, I told Elizabeth over the phone. They can't foreclose over fence posts. Actually, they might be able to. HOA foreclosure laws in this state are pretty aggressive. If a judge rules that you materially violated covenants and failed to remedy the violation, they could take my ranch? It's possible. David, I think you need to consider settling. Margaret's clearly willing to destroy you to get that property. That night, I walked my fence line in the cold December air, looking at the gap where Margaret's crew had torn out my repairs. 15 acres of the most beautiful land in the county, 3 generations of my family's history, and some power-hungry HOA president thought she could just take it all away with legal paperwork. But Margaret had forgotten something important. I'd been playing the long game in real estate for 20 years. The next morning, I made a call to my property manager. Tom, I need you to run the numbers on the courthouse annex building. What's our monthly rental income from the county? The Morrison building? Let's see. $43,000 a month, plus utilities and maintenance fees. Why? How much would it cost to make some improvements to the judicial facilities? 2 weeks later, Judge Morrison walked into his newly renovated chambers to find mahogany bookshelves, hand-carved crown molding, and a brass nameplate that read the Honorable Judge Morrison, courtesy of Morrison Property Holdings. I'd spent $200,000 upgrading his workspace, and every improvement bore my name as the building owner. Margaret's lawsuit was scheduled for the next morning. I arrived at the courthouse early, wanting to savor the moment. Elizabeth met me in the lobby, looking confident but concerned. David, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is our discovery evidence is rock solid. Margaret's clearly been using the HOA as a weapon to force you to sell. The bad news is Judge Morrison has a reputation for being very strict about property covenants. Even with harassment, he might still rule that you violated HOA procedures. I smiled. Don't worry about Judge Morrison. What do you mean? You'll see. We took our seats in the gallery, and I watched Margaret enter with her team of expensive lawyers. She wore a navy suit and her most confident smile, clearly expecting to walk out with my property deed in her briefcase. Judge Morrison took the bench at exactly 9:00 a.m., and his eyes immediately found mine in the gallery. He nodded slightly, not inappropriate, just the acknowledgement of a long-term business relationship. Good morning. We're here for Willowbrook Homeowners Association versus David Morrison. Counsel, are you ready to proceed? Margaret's lead attorney, a shark named Robert Kellerman, stood up first. Your Honor, this is a straightforward case of covenant violation and community property damage. The defendant willfully ignored established procedures, damaged common areas, and has shown consistent disregard for community standards. We're seeking full damages plus foreclosure relief. For 20 minutes, Kellerman painted me as a rogue property owner who thought he was above the rules. He presented Margaret's fabricated timeline, the fraudulent survey results, and a parade of HOA board members who testified about my aggressive non-compliance. It was a masterful performance, if you ignored the fact that every word was a lie. Then, Elizabeth stood up. "Your Honor, what we have here isn't covenant violation. It's systematic harassment designed to force my client to sell valuable property below market rates. The evidence will show that Mrs. Hendricks and the HOA board conspired to create artificial violations, ignored their own procedures, and weaponized community rules for personal gain." She started with the timeline, showing how Margaret's enforcement actions began weeks before any actual violation occurred. Then came the email evidence, proving Margaret had been planning to force me out long before the fence issue started. But the kill shot came when Elizabeth presented Bradley Hendricks Construction Company records. "Your Honor, the defendant's son received a $47,000 payment from the HOA for emergency fence removal on the same day his mother signed the enforcement order. His company also submitted a bid to develop Mr. Morrison's property into luxury condominiums, a bid that was contingent on current owner cooperation or involuntary transfer." Margaret's face went ashen. She'd been caught red-handed in a scheme to steal my property and hand it to her son's construction company. Judge Morrison leaned forward. "Mrs. Hendricks, are you telling this court that your family stood to profit financially from these enforcement actions?" Margaret's attorney tried to object, but the damage was done. Judge Morrison's expression had shifted from judicial neutrality to barely controlled anger. "Your Honor," Kellerman stammered, "any financial arrangements were purely coincidental to legitimate community enforcement." "Coincidental?" Judge Morrison's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "Counsel, I've reviewed the evidence submitted by the defense. This looks less like community enforcement and more like extortion." That's when I knew Margaret was finished. But Judge Morrison wasn't done. "Furthermore, I find the plaintiff's behavior in this matter to be not just inappropriate, but potentially criminal. Using HOA authority to target individual homeowners for personal gain violates numerous state statutes regarding abuse of fiduciary duty." He looked directly at Margaret, and his voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Mrs. Hendricks, you and your co-conspirators turned a community organization into your personal real estate acquisition tool. You fabricated violations, ignored due process, destroyed private property, and attempted to steal a man's home through fraudulent legal proceedings." Margaret tried to speak, but Judge Morrison held up his hand. "I'm not finished. This court finds that the plaintiff's actions constitute malicious prosecution, abuse of process, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Not only is this lawsuit dismissed with prejudice, but I'm awarding the defendant full attorney's fees, punitive damages, and compensation for property destruction." The gavel came down with that thunderous crack I mentioned at the beginning, and the numbers were even better than I'd hoped: $847,000 in total damages, plus an injunction barring the HOA from any further enforcement actions against my property. But the real satisfaction came from watching Margaret's face as Judge Morrison delivered the final blow. "Additionally, I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation and to the State HOA Regulatory Board for administrative action. Mrs. Hendricks, you may want to consider retaining criminal counsel." Margaret looked like she'd been hit by a truck. Her perfectly composed mask had crumbled completely, revealing the desperate, greedy person underneath. As we filed out of the courtroom, she grabbed my arm in the hallway. "You planned this," she hissed. "Somehow you knew." I gently removed her hand from my sleeve. "Margaret, I told you that you'd made the biggest mistake of your life. You just chose not to listen. This isn't over." I smiled and gestured around at the marble walls and brass fixtures of the courthouse annex. "Actually, it is. And Margaret? Next time you try to destroy someone's life, you might want to make sure you're not doing it in a building they own." Her eyes widened as the realization hit, and I walked away, savoring the look of absolute defeat on her face. The aftermath was swift and brutal for Margaret's little empire. The district attorney filed fraud charges within a week, and the state HOA board launched a full investigation into Willowbrook's finances. Turns out, Margaret's scheme to steal my property was just the tip of the iceberg. They found evidence of kickback schemes with maintenance contractors, inflated legal fees paid to Kellerman's firm, and a pattern of selective enforcement designed to drive out longtime homeowners so Margaret's cronies could buy their properties cheap. But I wasn't content to just watch the legal system slowly grind Margaret into dust. I had other plans. See, during discovery, Elizabeth had uncovered something interesting about the HOA's financial situation. They were carrying a massive loan on their community center renovation, a $2.3 million project that had gone way over budget thanks to Bradley's construction company inflating every invoice. The loan payments were bleeding the HOA dry, and they'd been covering the shortfall by raising dues and hitting homeowners with bogus violation fees. My case had exposed their entire financial house of cards, and now the bank was getting nervous. So I made a call to First National Bank, where I'd been doing business for 15 years. "Tom, this is David Morrison. I'd like to discuss a commercial loan acquisition." 3 weeks later, I owned the HOA's debt, all $2.3 million of it, which meant Margaret's HOA now owed money directly to the man they'd tried to destroy. The first thing I did was call an emergency meeting of all Willowbrook homeowners. Not the board, the actual residents who'd been getting screwed by Margaret's schemes for years. The community center was packed that Tuesday evening. Faces I recognized from around the neighborhood, people who'd been dealing with Margaret's arbitrary rules and escalating fees for years. Some looked curious, others skeptical, but everyone wanted answers. I stood up at the front of the room with a stack of financial documents Elizabeth had helped me prepare. "Good evening, everyone. I'm David Morrison, and I think it's time you knew exactly what your HOA board has been doing with your money." For the next hour, I laid out everything. The fraudulent enforcement actions, the kickback schemes, the way Margaret had been using the community association as her personal piggy bank. I showed them invoices where Bradley's company charged $500 to change a light bulb, $2,000 to trim a single tree, $15,000 for emergency fence removal that took 2 hours. The room got uglier by the minute. These people had been paying through the nose for substandard services while Margaret lined her family's pockets. "But here's the thing," I continued. "I now own your debt, which means I control your financial future." Dead silence. You could have heard a pin drop. Now I could foreclose on the community assets, dissolve the HOA, and leave you all to figure out road maintenance and landscaping on your own. Or, I smiled, we can do this the right way. I laid out my proposal. New board elections, transparent financial reporting, competitive bidding for all contracts, and most importantly, no more weaponized enforcement actions designed to drive people out of their homes. Those of you who want to live in a real community instead of Margaret Hendricks' personal fiefdom, I need you to vote. Those of you who prefer the old system, I shrugged. Well, I'm sure Margaret will be happy to continue serving the HOA from her jail cell. The vote was unanimous. Within 6 months, Margaret was facing criminal charges, Bradley's construction company was under investigation, and the entire HOA board had been replaced by people who actually gave a damn about their neighbors instead of their bank account. But my personal favorite revenge came in smaller, more intimate doses. Like the day I drove past Margaret's house and saw her in her front yard, furiously scrubbing graffiti off her mailbox. Someone had spray-painted FRAUD in big red letters, and it had been there for 3 days because the new HOA board had voted to suspend enforcement actions while they cleaned house. Or the time I ran into her at the grocery store and she tried to hide behind the cereal aisle when she saw me coming. She knocked over an entire display of cornflakes in her panic, and the teenage stockboy made her clean it up. "Rules are rules, ma'am," he said, with the kind of teenage indifference that must have cut her to the bone. But the absolute best moment came 6 weeks after the trial, when Margaret showed up at my front door. She looked terrible. Designer clothes replaced with a cheap blazer, perfect hair now showing gray roots, and the kind of desperate expression that comes from watching your entire world collapse in real time. "David, I need to talk to you." I considered slamming the door, but curiosity got the better of me. "Margaret, what can I do for you?" I want to apologize." Those words coming from Margaret Hendricks were so shocking, I actually stepped back. "For what, specifically?" She took a shaky breath. "For everything. The fence, the lawsuit, trying to take your home. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." I studied her face, looking for the angle, the manipulation, the scheme, but all I saw was genuine defeat. "What do you want, Margaret?" "The criminal charges. My lawyer says if I could get you to speak on my behalf, show that I'm making amends." And there it was. Even in her apology, Margaret was trying to work an angle. "You want me to help you avoid prison? Please, I'll lose everything. My house, my reputation, my family's business. Bradley's company is already filing for bankruptcy because of the investigation." I looked at this woman who'd tried to destroy my life over 2 fence posts, who'd weaponized an entire community organization to feed her greed, who'd shown up at my door with fake tears and a manipulation attempt disguised as an apology. "Margaret, do you remember what you told me that first morning by my fence?" She looked confused. What?" "You said rules are rules, and that you'd hate to see me face compliance action over something so preventable." Her face went white as she realized where this was going. "Well, Margaret, rules are rules. And the rule about fraud and conspiracy is pretty clear. You made your choices, and now you get to live with the consequences." I started to close the door, then paused. "Oh, and Margaret? Next time you want to destroy someone's life, you might want to make sure they don't own the courthouse where you're planning to do it." The door closed with a satisfying click, and I watched through the peephole as she stood there for a full minute, finally understanding that there would be no escape, no last-minute deal, no way out of the hole she dug for herself. 3 months later, Margaret pled guilty to fraud and conspiracy charges. She got 18 months in minimum security prison, 5 years probation, and a lifetime ban from serving on any HOA board in the state. Bradley's construction company collapsed completely, taking with it the inflated contracts and kickback schemes that had been bleeding the community dry for years. But justice wasn't finished with the Hendricks family yet. During the state investigation, auditors discovered that Margaret had been embezzling HOA funds for years, small amounts at first, but escalating to over $300,000 in stolen money used to fund her lavish lifestyle and Bradley's failed business ventures. The civil restitution alone was enough to force the sale of everything they owned, which is how I found myself at the foreclosure auction for Margaret's house on a crisp November morning, exactly 1 year after she'd first tried to steal my fence. The irony was perfect. The same courthouse steps where she'd planned to seize my ranch, now hosting the sale of her own home. I bid conservatively, letting other investors drive the price up to about 60% of market value before making my final offer. When the auctioneer's gavel fell, I owned the house where Margaret Hendricks had spent 8 years plotting against her neighbors. The first thing I did was evict the tenants Margaret had hastily moved in to try to generate income before the foreclosure. Then I hired Bradley's former crew, the same guys who'd torn down my fence, to completely renovate the property. I paid them double what Bradley used to, treated them with respect, and made sure they understood that good work deserved fair compensation. Amazing how motivated people get when they're not being exploited by their employer. 6 months later, I had a beautiful rental property that was generating steady income and providing affordable housing for a young family who appreciated having a landlord who actually maintained the property. But the real satisfaction came from the small touches I added during renovation, like the custom fence around the backyard, built to the exact same specifications as my ranch fence, with a small brass plaque reading installed with proper permits 2025. Or the mailbox I had custom made, with MORISO, NPROPERTY etched in elegant script, where Margaret's name used to be. Every time I drove past to check on the property, I remembered that cold October morning when she'd clicked across my gravel in her designer heels, thinking she could intimidate me into submission. Now she was in prison, and I was collecting rent from her former home. The universe, as they say, has a sense of humor about these things. The ripple effects of Margaret's downfall spread far beyond Willowbrook. Word got around about what happened when HOA boards overplayed their hands, and suddenly, power-drunk community leaders across the county started thinking twice before targeting homeowners with frivolous violations. I started getting calls from people facing similar situations. A retired teacher whose HOA was trying to force her to remove her vegetable garden. A veteran who'd been hit with violations for parking his work truck in his own driveway. A young couple facing thousands in fines for painting their front door the wrong shade of blue. Each time, I'd connect them with Elizabeth Chen and share the same advice. Document everything, know your rights, and never underestimate the power of playing the long game. Some cases settled quickly when HOA boards realized they were dealing with homeowners who wouldn't be intimidated. Others went to court, and judges who'd heard about the Willowbrook case started taking fraudulent enforcement actions more seriously. But my personal favorite was the case of Harold Zimmerman, an elderly widower whose HOA was trying to force him out because his late wife's rose garden violated their new water-efficient landscaping requirements. Harold called me in tears, explaining how the roses were the last connection he had to his wife of 47 years. The HOA wanted them ripped out within 30 days, replaced with desert plants that would fit their new aesthetic vision. Mr. Morrison, I don't know what to do. These roses are all I have left of Eleanor. I thought about my own property, about the generational history that Margaret had tried to erase with her schemes, and I made a decision. Harold, what if I told you there was a way to keep your roses and make the HOA pay for trying to take them? It took 3 months of legal maneuvering, but we proved that Harold's roses had been grandfathered under the original community covenants, and that the new board had violated their own procedures in trying to force their removal. The settlement not only protected Harold's garden, but established a precedent that HOAs couldn't retroactively change rules to target existing landscaping without proper notice and due process. Harold sent me a photo last spring, him and his roses in full bloom, with a small memorial stone for Eleanor nestled among the bushes. The inscription read, "Eleanor's garden protected by community, preserved by love." That photo sits on my desk now, right next to the brass nameplate from Judge Morrison's chambers and the final foreclosure notice from Margaret's house. Reminders that sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies, it's building something better in the space they tried to tear down. These days, Willowbrook is actually a pretty nice place to live. The new HOA board focuses on maintaining common areas and organizing community events instead of harassing homeowners over nonsense violations. Property values have gone up, neighbor relations have improved, and people actually wave when they see each other instead of wondering who's going to get hit with a citation next. Margaret's former house has become home to the Johnsons, a young military family who love the neighborhood and take pride in maintaining their property. Their kids play in the same backyard where Margaret used to plot against her neighbors, But now it's filled with laughter instead of schemes. And my fence? It's still standing exactly where it always was, marking the boundaries of my property and serving as a daily reminder that some lines should never be crossed. Sometimes I stand out there in the morning with my coffee, looking across my 15 acres of rolling hills and remembering that October morning when Margaret thought she could take it all away with permits and violations and legal threats. She was so focused on tearing down what I'd built. She never stopped to consider who she was really dealing with. That, as they say, was her first mistake. And her last. But my favorite part of the whole story happened 3 months after the trial. I was out fixing my fence with proper permits this time, just to be petty, when Jim Kowalski walked over with his morning coffee. "David, you hear what happened to Margaret's house?" "No, what?" He grinned. "Foreclosure auction yesterday. Seems all those legal fees and criminal defense costs ate up her savings. Bank's taking the house next month." I looked up from my fence post, hammer in hand. "That's too bad." "Gets better," Jim continued. "Guess who bought it at auction for half the market value?" My smile must have given it away because Jim started laughing. "You didn't." "I did. Margaret Hendricks is about to become my tenant." "And Jim?" "I run a very strict rental operation. Lots of rules and regulations." We stood there, chuckling, while my horses grazed peacefully in the background, the morning sun casting long shadows across the 15 acres that Margaret had tried so hard to steal. Justice, as it turned out, was a lot like good fencing. It required the right materials, proper planning, and most importantly, knowing exactly where your boundaries were. And sometimes it helped to own the courthouse where your enemies thought they were going to destroy you. 6 months later, I got a letter from the new HOA board, the court-appointed one that actually follows the law. They wanted to apologize for the previous administration's actions and ask if I'd considered joining the Architectural Review Committee. I wrote back, politely declining, but I did include a photo of my newly completed fence. Same height, same materials, same location as always. But this time, I'd added a small brass plaque on the gatepost. "Morrison Ranch established 2009, defended 2024. Margaret's old house sits empty now, about a quarter-mile down the road from my property. Sometimes I drive past it on my way to town and remember that cold October morning when she clicked across my gravel in her designer heels, thinking she could intimidate me into giving up my home. She was so focused on the fence she wanted to tear down, she never bothered to check who owned the ground she was standing on. And that, as they say, made all the difference. Last week, I got a call from a homeowner in the next county over. Similar story, HOA board targeting his property, fraudulent violations, threats of foreclosure. Apparently, word's gotten around about what happened to Margaret Hendricks, and people are starting to fight back. I gave him Elizabeth Jen's number and some simple advice. When someone threatens to take your home, make sure you know exactly who you're dealing with. And more importantly, make sure they don't know who they're dealing with. Because sometimes the person they're trying to destroy owns the very ground they're standing on. And sometimes justice has a sense of humor about these things.